Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, DOT's Proposed Oral Fluid Guidelines, What You Need to Know. I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group and I'll be conducting today's presentation. If you have any problems seeing or hearing today's webinar presentation, please use the chat section. Questions for today's presenters can be entered into the questions section. We will be recording this presentation and we'll share with you that recording after the event. Also, today's presentation qualifies for continuing education from SHRM, CCDAP, and from HRCI for those who attend the live presentation in its entirety. So we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation today. We'd like to thank Current Consulting Group and OraSure Technologies for coming together to present this timely topic to you. Again, it's called DOT's Proposed Oral Fluid Guidelines, What You Need to Know. Today's presenters are Jackie Perrone from OraSure Technologies and Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group. Jackie is the program leader for OraSure's Technology Risk Assessment Division. She has 25 years of experience in the drug testing industry, working at OraSure for the past 12 years and with Roche Diagnostics Corporation for 15 years prior to joining OraSure. Also with us is Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group. He's the author of Why Drug Testing, Updated and Expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books on substance-related issues. He founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has become the #1 recognized brand name in compliance, business development, and operations consulting in the drug testing industry. And so with that, we'll go ahead and turn the virtual microphone over to Bill.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. As Jessica mentioned, I started this company in 1998, and I can remember the very first industry survey that we did. I know many of you are familiar with the industry survey that Current Consulting Group does every year. We're now in our 24th year of doing it. And in that first survey, nobody mentioned oral fluid drug testing. And gradually over time, it started getting mentioned by people in the survey until it became a really hot topic. And so this has been building up for the federal government to recognize oral fluid drug testing. I refer to it in an article that I just wrote that'll be out in our current compliance newsletter next month as a sea change development, because this is really quite significant. And I think as Jackie, we're going to divide this up into the pieces that you see on the screen here for the agenda. When she gets to her part, you'll see really sort of some of the intricacy involved in this notice of proposed rulemaking. Now, let me make a couple of key points here. One is that a notice of proposed rulemaking doesn't mean that they're considering it. It means that they've considered it, and here's what we're looking at doing. We want public comment. So there's going to be a public comment period. I'll talk about that here in a second. But DOT is doing this. It's not as if they're floating some idea out there to see what the reaction will be. We will someday, in the not too distant future, at least relatively speaking, have DOT guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing. That's #1. #2, I was on a webinar presentation yesterday, and one of the questions that was asked was, why did DOT skip hair testing and go to oral fluid testing? And my response to that wasn't really that they skipped hair testing. It's that there are no federal guidelines in place for hair testing. You may recall that in October of 2019, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, came out with final oral fluid mandatory guidelines for federal workplace drug testing programs. So in the federal government, SAMHSA approved lab-based oral fluid testing, and they came out with specific procedural regulations for that. So DOT, which is governed by those SAMHSA guidelines, 49 CFR Part 40, they must adhere to those guidelines, but there are no 49 CFR Part 40 guidelines for hair testing. So it's not like DOT skipped hair testing or prefers oral fluid testing to hair testing. I think hair testing is fantastic, but it's not ready yet from a procedural regulatory development process on the government side. And so the next thing, if DOT was going to do anything at all, was oral fluid testing. And of course, this is really, really big news that they chose to come out with a notice of proposed rulemaking for oral fluid drug testing, lab-based oral fluid testing specifically. Now, that came out on February 28th. You can go online and just put in DOT, NPRM, oral fluid, or any kind of combination of those words and acronyms in a Google search, and you'll find the Federal Register listing for February 28th, just a few short weeks ago, and you'll find the notice of proposed rulemaking from DOT. It's a lot, okay? There's a lot of reading there. We're condensing it to less than 40 slides today, so we're not going to go into great detail on every aspect of it, but we're going to hit the highlights. Some of it doesn't really even pertain to oral fluid testing, but we're going to hit those highlights as well, because we know we have a very diverse audience with us today. As I mentioned, prior to the notice of proposed rulemaking, the NPRM from DOT, SAMHSA had issued guidelines back in October, on October 25th, 2019, finalizing guidelines, I should say, for oral fluid testing. Again, lab-based oral fluid testing. And that's significant because without that, DOT wouldn't have been able to consider, or, and as is the case today, come out with a notice of proposed rulemaking for oral fluid testing, much hinged on those SAMHSA guidelines, which came out in October 2019. So there's still an implementation period going on. As everybody in the industry knows, COVID sort of wreaked havoc on that implementation process, which SAMHSA thought back in October 2019 would be maybe a year to a year and a half before federal agencies could start using lab-based oral fluid testing. That's sort of been, it's been directly affected by COVID, no doubt about that. So it's taking a little bit longer than any of us thought it would. I don't think the same is going to be true with these DOT guidelines. We're really sort of out of COVID, keep our fingers crossed, of course, and the government's functioning full speed ahead. And they've issued this notice of proposed rulemaking at this time because I think they anticipate being able to finalize the guidelines. Now, there's a period of time. It was originally 30 days, basically, but now it's 60 days. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I thought I had it coming up here, but the comment period is 60 days, goes till April 29th, and I think it is coming up on a slide here in a minute. And so you, me, anybody in the industry, employers, et cetera, trade associations, et cetera, we all have this period of time to review the notice of proposed rulemaking and submit comments. And we encourage you to do that. I'm going to go through some of the areas that DOT is asking for comments on. And as you go through that, some of it may be very important to you. And as such, we encourage you to submit comments. I say that as a preface to the fact that it's going to take them months to go through the comments, to sort of decipher them, to verify certain things. We're going to submit comments about, say, the window of detection. And this is what we think the window of detection is in oral fluid testing for these drugs. What's our source for that? And they're going to go through and they're going to analyze it, verify it, come to final conclusions. They may change a few things. I don't think they'll come out with another notice of proposed rulemaking based on that process, but it's going to be a process that takes time. Again, I don't think it's going to take as long as the SAMHSA implementation process that we're going through now, but let's say it's some period of months, several months even, before they go through all of those comments and everything comes back and they say, okay, here's the final, regulation for DOT oral fluid testing. Then there'll be an implementation period. By then, we'll have lots of things in place from the SAMHSA guidelines that came out back in October of 2019. So that's why I think that process will speed along a little bit faster than the SAMHSA process. It will already have laboratories that can be certified in oral fluid testing under SAMHSA. We'll have MRO regulations in place, collector issues, and some of those will be in place already. My point is that DOT is not starting from scratch like SAMHSA was. SAMHSA's done a Herculean effort, made a Herculean effort to get where they are with this. And so DOT is sort of jumping into that process. As I say that, though, I'm just really impressed with all the work that DOT's done to get to this point. As I said, this is a sea change development in our industry. For 30 plus years, DOT has only allowed lab-based urine testing. And in the preamble to the oral fluid mandatory guidelines back in October 2019, SAMHSA said this: the scientific basis for the use of oral fluid as an alternative specimen for drug testing has now been broadly established, and the advances in the use of oral fluid in detecting drugs have made it possible for this alternative specimen to be used in federal programs with the same level of confidence that has been applied to the use of urine. I share that quote as part of this presentation because DOT also shared a version of it in the notice of proposed rulemaking that came out a few weeks ago. This is key. The government would not have made these strides toward allowing lab-based oral fluid testing if the science wasn't there. There are a lot of other advantages that we're going to talk about that are part of the notice of proposed rulemaking. But if the science wasn't there, if it couldn't do what urine can do, or even do it better maybe in some instances, in some situations, we wouldn't even be talking about oral fluid testing now. But the federal government, after years of looking at this, right? I mean, some of us go back, 15, 20 years on this issue with the federal government. If all those years of looking at this, they've come to the conclusion that the science is sound and it's at least equal to. And they refer to oral fluid as an alternative specimen. It is, in essence, an alternative to urine, of course. But I think the day will come when we won't even refer to oral fluid as an alternative. It'll just be one of the two options available from the federal government for DOT testing, urine and oral fluid through a laboratory. Now, some things have happened over the last few years since SAMHSA came out with their guidelines in 2019. COVID hit, of course, and that really created a lot of problems for employers who were trying to get collections done, traditional urine collections at an offsite collection facility. Some of them went out of business. Some of those locations changed their hours. Many of them, by necessity, were doing mostly COVID type of treatment and testing. And it became very difficult for employers to find, traditional outlets for their collection needs during COVID, especially during that first year when, COVID was at its worst. Now, we know from the industry survey that Current Consulting Group does every year, this is our 24th annual this year, and I do want to acknowledge that OraSure is one of our co-sponsors of that survey, and we appreciate that very much. But one of the big trends that we've seen in that survey is the percentage of drug testing providers who say they now offer oral fluid testing. In our 2021 survey, the one that came out last year, 73% of providers said they now offer oral fluid testing. That was up from 63% the year before in 2020 and up from 37% in 2019. That's a huge increase. That's why we typically refer to oral fluid testing as the fastest growing segment of the drug testing industry, because so many more providers are now at least offering it. They're looking for ways to meet their clients' needs. As I mentioned, some of it because of COVID forced employers to look at alternatives that are now becoming more common. Chief among those, I think, is oral fluid testing. I think the notice of proposed rulemaking from DOT is just going to accelerate that increase in companies that offer it, and in employers, the end users, the buyers of drug testing. It's going to increase the percentage of those individuals who are willing to look at an alternative or who are requesting information specifically about oral fluid testing. When SAMHSA came out with their final guidelines in October of 2019, they estimated that eventually when DOT adopted the same guidelines, or the DOT version of the guidelines, that between 20 and 25% of all DOT drug tests would eventually transition from urine to oral fluid testing. So out of a pool of 6 million DOT tests, that's about the number that that DOT generates every year among private transportation companies. That 20 to 25% would be somewhere around 1.5 to 1.8 million drug tests. Now, outside of that, think of this: there's about 30 to 40 million workplace drug tests conducted every year. Now, we're not sure about those numbers because COVID has certainly caused some companies to discontinue testing. Some of them have not reinstated testing yet, et cetera. But we think it's somewhere around 30 to 40 million drug tests. If, say, 25% of 40 million drug tests transition to oral fluid, that's another 10 million. So if oral fluid testing today represents about 8% of market share, just to pick a number, but I think it's somewhere maybe in that range, we're talking about pretty significant encroachment in the urine testing market share going forward over the next few years as a result of these federal guidelines, first from SAMHSA and then from DOT. So that's a little bit of setting the table. Let's get into some specifics here. So I think most people maybe are not familiar with exactly what oral fluid testing is, but you're testing the saliva or an oral fluid secretion that's obtained through the mouth, of course. And with oral fluid in the laboratory, and even with the rapid result devices as well, but let me stick to laboratory testing because that's what DOT is proposing. You're able to detect both the parent drug and a metabolite of the drug. So let's say somebody's using marijuana. With oral fluid, you're able to detect the actual THC as well as the metabolic breakdown of the drug in the human body. So because you're able to detect the parent drug, you're able to detect drug use almost immediately, within 15 minutes after somebody uses the drug. You can also detect a metabolite of the drug in oral fluid. But the big difference between urine and oral fluid testing is that with urine testing, you're only detecting the metabolite. So that takes some period of hours, let's say 6 to 7 hours, before the drug becomes detectable in a urine sample, as opposed to oral fluid, where you're looking at a period of minutes, say up to 15 minutes, but then the drug becomes detectable because you're able to detect the parent drug itself. You're not waiting for the metabolite to become detectable. That's significant, right? Because that makes it possible to say that your oral fluid testing program is capable of detecting recent drug use. And that's important in a lot of different states that have legalized marijuana and are requiring employers to make a connection between a positive test result for THC and some proof or evidence that the drug use was recent and has contributed to that individual's impairment or being under the influence. There may be other things that you're tracking, like aberrant behavior, increased tardiness, accidents, etc., that maybe trigger a reasonable suspicion test. But being able to say that we're using a detection method that shows recent drug use is, I think, going to be a critical factor in the next few years as more and more states not only move to legalize marijuana, we're up to 39 counting the District of Columbia, but that also place these restrictions on employers in terms of what they can do with a positive result. Now, there's the slide I was looking for, that second bullet there. The comment period for the NPRM is now April 29th. That was the right thing to do. There's a ton of information, a lot of people out there trying to decipher and discern and figure out what comments they want to make. So, extending it the extra 30 days to April 29th, I think was a good move on the part of DOT. Applaud them for that. It's important to note that we're still in this process. So right now, today, under the DOT regulations, you still can only use urine testing. Okay, so these guidelines don't apply to DOT yet, these proposed guidelines. They're just quote unquote proposed at this stage. But I think that there's some value beyond that in non-DOT drug testing. Companies have been doing oral fluid drug testing for many years now, outside of the DOT or federal requirements, where oral fluid has not been allowed. So, these guidelines now provide sort of a blueprint for how to do lab-based oral fluid testing that I think a lot of non-DOT covered employers will really appreciate. It's a gold standard for how to do lab-based oral fluid testing. And to a certain extent, rapid result oral fluid testing. It's not apples to apples, but there are a lot of components in these proposed regulations that could apply to rapid oral fluid testing as well. But it's important to note that you still can't use oral fluid for DOT. The day is coming, but I think outside of the DOT regulations, there's some value to it as a blueprint for increasing the integrity and the legal defensibility of your oral fluid testing program outside of a DOT mandated program. Now, as you look at the NPRM, it's really kind of presented in two parts. The first part is, you see that sort of first sub bullet there. The first part highlights the background, the foundation for the proposal. I personally find all of that part fascinating. Sort of the inside the thought process that DOT went through, and there's a lot of really good information in there, so don't skip that. The second part, though, is sort of the proposed verbiage, as you might say, and that's where they're looking for comments on the proposed processes and procedures. What I like about the NPRM, just like with the final guidelines that came out from SAMHSA in 2019, is they share the reasons why they're doing this. And so among the reasons you see in that second section, those 5 sub-bullets there, to combat adulteration, to thwart drug cheating and subversion efforts. I like that part of it. to possibly make all collections directly observed, which is possible with oral fluid without violating anybody's privacy. Potential cost savings. There's some really good information in the NPRM on cost savings. It talks about the quick, easy specimen collection process. DOT really focused on that. I think they're looking for ways to ease the burden on employers that are covered by the regulations in some of the sort of awkward parts of the regulations that have existed for 30 years now. One of them is in the collection process. I think the collection process is so critical to the overall drug testing procedure. And, you know, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think collectors are sort of the unsung heroes of our industry, but there's, you know, it's a hard part of what we do to monitor very closely. Oral fluid testing solves a lot of those inherent issues with urine collections. And I'm a fan of urine drug testing. So, but in the interest of talking about oral fluid, I'll just sort of advance past my praise for urine testing here. And then it sort of relieves the burden on where collections are going to take place and the use of off-site collection facilities as a patent requirement for employers. You can do collections with oral fluids anywhere, anytime. And the nice thing about it is, and this is right in the NPRM, you don't necessarily have to use a professional technician. You can train employees to observe the process and serve as sort of an observer / collector right there in the workplace. And that's part of the cost savings and the soft dollar cost savings that I'm going to talk about here in a minute. Look at that last bullet though. Primarily the NPRM is a place where DOT seeks comments on their proposal and asks questions about key issues. That's what I want you to focus on as you go through. You can look at our presentation today, but go into the NPRM and look at what they're seeking comment on. I'm going to talk about some of those things right now. Some of it may be very important to you. If so, send in some comments. Even if you don't have everything documented and citation, et cetera, let DOT know what you're thinking because they're hoping that this will be helpful to you. But let's go through several things. So NPR includes many calls for comments you see in the first bullet there. The majority of them fall into these several categories here. So I'm going to read these bullets so as not to skim over or leave anything out or make one thing seem more important than the other. So collection procedures, cost savings, drug detection windows, we're going to spend some time on that in a minute, laboratory procedures, MRO procedures, oral fluid devices, generally speaking, and very specifically, regulatory organizational scheme, the substance abuse professional procedures, specimen costs, testing circumstances, and some information about urine testing. Now, as I said at the outset, not everything in the NPRM is directly related to oral fluid testing, but that doesn't matter because we all come to this with different, unique disciplines in what we do and the services that we provide. So there are parts of the NPRM that are not really related to oral fluid testing that would be important to a lot of people on today's webinar. So we'll talk about some of those in brief. Now there are a couple of dense slides coming up and I apologize. We normally try to keep it very loose as you're going to see on the next slide, but this particular slide, it was some of the questions that DOT was asking, it was just too important to sort of try to pare it down to 3 or 4 words. So let me take you through a few of these, okay? So DOT is presenting questions. Will regulated employers, these are companies that are covered under the DOT regulations, and remember that's all DOT modes, not just the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, but it's FAA, FTA, FRA, PHMSA, etc. Okay? Will regulated employers continue to use external collection services, offsite collection sites, or train their staff to do collections in-house? They want to know what you think. What will be the trend there? If companies choose to train their own staff to perform collections, why do they do so? What's the motivation for that? And then who can collect a specimen under the DOT regulations? Of course, we're talking about oral fluid. What should be the requirements to monitor someone demonstrating collection process proficiency? That's an important issue, right? But it's different than urine because urine is forgive me for putting it this way, very hands-on, okay? Oral fluid testing is much easier, collections are much easier to do because you're really observing the process as the collector. You're making sure the paperwork gets done correctly and that nobody, substitutes a specimen, etc. But it's a very different process being a collector / observer for oral fluid than the traditional urine collector. There's a lot that goes into that that's somewhat eliminated on the oral fluid collection. For example, we're not securing a restroom, we're not putting blue dye in the toilet water, we're not turning off the hot water that runs into that restroom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of those things. But also the role of the collector as well changes. Well, who's going to observe, who's going to provide the training for that? Who's going to observe the proficiency testing that collectors typically have to go through? There's a whole section on that in the NPRM that's worth reviewing. Skipping over to the other side, who decides when to collect an alternative specimen, and if a qualified collector or employer makes a decision about testing methodology after an insufficient specimen occurs, like the person wasn't able to provide enough urine for the test, can we switch to oral fluid, or possibly vice versa? Okay. DOT requests comments on direct observation. Okay, should a licensed medical professional be allowed to observe an oral fluid collection? Whether there should be limitations on what types of medical professionals can perform a collection. And then the last bullet on the slide, whether permitting donors to rinse up to 8 ounces of water is appropriate, and whether measuring fewer than 8 ounces would be difficult. So it gets into some minutiae, into some details there, okay? Again, good to go through it and become familiar with it and comment on the things that are important to you. Here's a little repetition, but a key point. Will regulated employers continue to use external qualified collectors, or will they train their own people to do that? I think that it'll be a combination of both, but I think there's some advantage to oral fluid collections on site by trained individuals of the company that provide some very attractive benefits to the employer, cost-saving benefits. There are, if you look in the NPRM, you see that they focus on that in terms of, sort of trying to measure or gauge the soft dollar savings from oral fluid testing versus urine testing. And one of them is, the hours that it takes for an individual to travel to, wait at, and return from an offsite collection site where you have a professional technician do the collection versus staying there in the workplace and having a trained employer do that. What are the cost benefits of that? And I think that will motivate a lot of companies, especially once they experience how easy it is to collect or observe the collection of an oral fluid sample. I think it's going to motivate a lot of employers to do that. Look at the last bullet. Collectors should be cross-trained. If you're a professional collector, yeah, you're going to want to be able to offer that service. Now, I did a presentation before COVID to a group of TPAs, third-party administrators of drug testing. I was talking about oral fluid testing. That was my subject, so it's what they asked me to speak on. And I got a lot of pushback from the audience when it came to, employers doing their own collections. And part of that is because in our industry, let's be honest, there's revenue that we gain from collecting a urine specimen. I get that, and I'm for that. But I think going forward, as employers look to work around some of the obstacles created by things like pandemics, the legalization of marijuana, and tightening budgets in this economy, I think they're going to be looking for ways to sort of trim that down. My encouragement to TPAs and other drug testing providers is do both. Become experts at oral fluid testing and collecting oral fluid samples and being the consultant to your client on this issue, because they're going to need help with that, but they're going to go in that direction in, I think, a growing percentage. Now, one key area that DOT asked for comment on was drug detection windows, window detection. And you'll see that we have the drugs listed in the far left column, and then the next column to the right of that are the proposed oral fluid window detection numbers that DOT put in the proposed rulemaking. And then next to it, we put the generally accepted oral fluid window detection numbers. And then to the right of those are the same for urine testing. I just want to point out that there are some differences, right? For amphetamines, generally accepted window of detection is up to 2 days. DOT in the NPRM said 1 to 3 days. So there are some differences here. Amphetamines, 1 to 4 days, generally up to 2 days. Cocaine, 1 to 4, generally up to 3 days. Go down to marijuana though. So in the proposed rulemaking, they say that the window of detection for THC is up to 24 hours. Generally accepted for a casual user, it's up to a day. For a chronic user, it could be up to 2 days in an oral fluid sample. This is an important issue because of, among other reasons, but because of the legalization of marijuana and the push to prevent employers from being able to use a positive drug test result as the basis for adverse employment action. And so think of it this way. Let me actually go to the next slide because it'll demonstrate it. So this is sort of what the window of detection looks like when you compare blood, oral fluid, urine, and hair. Let me talk about those four first. So because you can detect the parent drug, as I said, in an oral fluid sample and in a blood sample, you're able to detect use almost immediately after somebody has ingested a drug. With urine, you've got that lag time of, say, 6 to 7 hours or a little bit more before the metabolite becomes detectable. These are important issues because in states that have legalized marijuana, you want to be able to say that, you know, we use a drug testing method that can detect drug use almost immediately after somebody ingests the drug. You can't say that with urine. You certainly can't say that with hair. You can say it with blood, but blood testing for workplace drug testing purposes is not allowed in virtually every state under normal conditions and circumstances. You can with oral fluid testing. Lab-based oral fluid testing outside of the DOT regulations already legally permitted without any obstacles at all in 47 out of 50 states, the exceptions being Vermont, Maine, and Hawaii. And I think now with these DOT regulations, you'll see all three of those states drop their objections. And in fact, we've already seen that in Maine. So this is important because if you talk about marijuana use, you want a drug testing method that covers the entire window of impairment. I'm not talking about window of detection. You want a detection window that covers the entire window of impairment. Study came out last summer from the University of Sydney that analyzed 80 different studies on window of detection from THC, and they concluded that the window of impairment for THC is about 3 to 10 hours. So in other words, the high may wear off, the intoxication may wear off, but the individual could still very well be impaired by their marijuana use for several hours after they no longer feel high, meaning there's still a danger in the workplace. So you want to use a drug testing method that covers that entire window of impairment. If it's too short, only a couple, 3 hours, then you're missing 70 to 80% of all the people who potentially are impaired on the job by marijuana and subject to causing more accidents and all the negative impact of that. Oral fluid testing is now the only government endorsed testing method that is capable of detecting recent use. And that's highlighted specifically in the notice of proposed rulemaking. Now, let me skip along kind of quickly here on a couple of points. Laboratory procedures, they ask questions about faxing. Is that still relevant? They propose changing the requirement that labs keep non-negative specimens from 1 year, reducing it down to 90 days. What do you think of that? And will adding new data elements increase costs or otherwise impose a quantifiable burden on laboratories? So labs want to respond to that. There's a lot in the NPRM on MRO services, some of it directly about oral fluid, some of it not. I want to just, I want to get to actually, well, let me say a few things about this slide just real quickly. Should the MRO staff be able to contact pharmacies to verify prescriptions? Yes, no. Is there cost savings involved for the MRO depending on how DOT goes on that? Can canceled tests be uncanceled by an MRO? Those are all questions that DOT is asking in this notice of proposed rulemaking. Keeping in mind when we talk about prescriptions that marijuana is still a Schedule I controlled substance, it can't legally be prescribed by a doctor. DOT seeks comments on whether the guidelines should address any additional differences between urine and oral fluid. That's a big part of it. I would focus your attention on that when you go through the NPRM. If there are devices that exist that allow a single specimen to be collected or subdivided into like a split specimen, and Jackie will talk about that in a little bit. I also want to talk, I want to spend just a minute on this slide though, the regulatory organizational scheme. A lot of us don't, you know, in the industry, we maybe don't pay as much attention to this part of it as we should, but you see in that first bullet, DOT questions if cross-references in Part 40 are helpful and applicable. I personally think they are. I think it makes everything easier to follow and easier to sort of verify and look things up. So I'm in favor of that, but they're seeking comments. You see in those 4 sections there, the 4 bullets under DOT seeks comments on. I just want to talk about the first one, whether including a table referring to old sections of the, referring old sections to the new sections is more trouble than it's worth. It may be more trouble to them, but I think that would be helpful. So I'm in favor. We'll submit a comment from Current Consulting Group on that. There's a lot in the NPRM relatively speaking, on substance abuse professionals or SAPs. That may not be absolutely, pertinent to you, but we're all affected by it. So it's important to become knowledgeable about the comments that are requested for SAP issues, like the first one: can a SAP conduct virtual interviews? Will virtual evaluations be allowed in other states, depending on where a SAP is licensed? And what about, in times when we're not in a pandemic? Should virtual SAP assessments be limited to certain circumstances, such as natural disasters, pandemics, etc.? So I think the role of the SAP always very important, critical to what we do as an industry and what employers rely on, but a part of our industry that's changing by necessity. Now, there's some really cool stuff in the NPRM about cost. I'd refer you to that. They'd like some input on the cost of an oral fluid test. We've done a little bit of research. We think it generally ranges between $15 and $35, but it depends a lot on which drugs you're testing for. Of course, volume, how many drugs a company conducts in a year, that's always a factor in determining the cost of a test, and whether the laboratory is conducting the testing or if you're using a rapid result device. But they would like some comment on that. So if you have experience with it, we recommend that you make some comments and give them as much information to go on there. If you look at oral fluid testing at $15 to $35, in some cases it's going to be less expensive than a traditional urine test, but maybe a little bit more depending on the volume. So you got to look at that and determine whether that's an attractive aspect of oral fluid testing for you. In fact, we have a survey coming up that we're going to send out at the end of today's webinar, and we're going to ask you some questions about that. So we hope that you'll participate in that. But I did mention earlier the soft dollar savings from oral fluid testing, reduced time away from work, particularly revolving around collections and sending people to offsite collection facilities. The fact that you don't need to necessarily involve a DER supervisor to accompany somebody to an offsite collection site, and just the time it takes to deal with a collection site versus having somebody provide an oral fluid sample right at the workplace without having to involve anybody else in the process. And then testing circumstances. Should certain circumstances like pre-employment and random testing be limited to urine, and post-accident and reasonable suspicion be limited to oral fluid? Or should employers have the option to choose the testing method that they prefer regardless of the circumstances? That's what I think. I think urine and oral fluid testing should be open to any circumstance, because there are definitely going to be times when it's just easier to collect an oral fluid sample. I think it works for pre-employment testing. I think it works for random testing as well. I don't see any limitation to when you can do an oral fluid test. And for years, we've relied on urine testing in all circumstances. So I don't really see a need to make those kind of constraints, but that's something that they're seeking guidance on. I want to refer you to the second bullet on the right side. In the case of a post-accident or reasonable suspicion test, should an oral fluid test could be administered at the scene? Absolutely, and they want comments on that. But that's one of the real benefits of oral fluid testing, is that you can do it anytime, anywhere, under virtually any circumstance. And so, and even that third bullet, there are fewer requirements for oral fluid collection sites, et cetera, et cetera. They just want you to comment on that, and especially if you've had some success or some experience doing that. And then just wrapping up my part of it, testing circumstances. I really sort of went through this slide already, so let me skip past this a little bit. Urine testing, they do see comments on some urine testing issues. As you see there, how frequently are direct observations required, or do they occur? That's always been a little bit of a controversial issue when it comes to urine testing. Something required under very limited circumstances in the DOT regulations under Part 40, and there are guidelines for that. But with oral fluid testing, those concerns really go away. So, but just we packed a lot into the first part of this presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, but please submit your questions and let us know what you're thinking, what questions you have, and if there's anything that we didn't cover and that we can't answer in the Q&A section, we'll respond after the fact. So let me turn the virtual microphone over to my partner today, Jackie Perrone.
Thank you, Bill, very much. And as Bill said, it's a ton of information. You know, there's just multiple pages, and the DOT has done a really good job of kind of going through and asking different questions of various folks within the drug testing industry. And so, you know, like Bill, we encourage you guys to take a look, either independently comment on your own, or I know that DASHA, SAPA, and DASA, a number of the industry associations are looking for people to comment to them as well. And then they will kind of put everybody's comments together, summarize, and submit on behalf of their membership. So there's lots of ways for people to comment. You know, if you don't want to comment directly onto the government site, you can go to any one of the associations and industry groups that are out there that are commenting as well. So we're going to kind of turn things over, and there's not too much left, but we're going to really talk about who's impacted, and then look at some other things in a little bit more in depth. So all DOT regulated employers and employees will be impacted by the eventual guidelines. And so Bill talked a little bit about the federal guidelines, the oral fluid mandated guidelines that came out for federal workers back in 2019 and were you know, implementable as of 2020. And that, I think everybody remembers that federal is not DOT. So if you've ever heard Patrice Kelly talk, or anyone from ODAPSI or the DOT, they make it very clear that the DOT has their own guidelines, as does the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And those folks, what they do basically is they look at the federal guidelines as kind of their guidepost, and then they draw their own regulations based on kind of the science and what's in there. And that's really where we're at right now. So who is covered? So it's basically, we've got two slides here. So it's the usual suspects, anybody that does DOT testing for urine, it would be the same folks here. So your Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the Railroad Administration, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, as well as the FTA. So anyone essentially with a CDL license, your pipeline and hazmat folks, and then the United States Coast Guard. So you'll notice here we don't talk about the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that's because they again have their own set of separate guidelines. So for now, the DOT guidelines will just cover those groups. So when do I need to comply? And Bill talked a little bit about the implementation timeline. So kind of here's what we know. So we know that SAMHSA, and if you remember, Bill spoke about how long of a process that was for SAMHSA and the federal guidelines. For those of you that have been around a while, and Bill and I are both kind of showing our age, we remember back in 1999 when the original guidelines were first thought about many years ago, relative to a number of changes, not only to the urine guidelines, but adding in oral fluid, adding in hair, the possibility of point of collection, point of care products. And so here we are, right? So the 2015 is when the federal guideline NPRM issued, and then the final guidelines issued in 2019, okay? So I don't think any of us think it's gonna be a 4-year time span between this NPRM for the DOT and the final guidelines being issued. I think all indications are it's going to be much sooner than that, but we don't really know how much time it's gonna take. But we do believe that just like with the federal guidelines, there is going to be an implementation period. And you'll see, you know, for the federal guidelines, oral fluid is still not officially yet permitted. Yes, COVID had a hand in delaying some things. I think initially, you know, the initial implementation period starting January of 2020, they felt like, you know, 12, 15, 18 months max. But with COVID hitting, there were a lot of things that got delayed. We know that the NLCP is very, very close. They've issued some of the MRO handbooks. They have issued some policies and procedures. They've been working with laboratory groups to ensure that the labs will be ready to, accept specimens. So all of these things are progressing, and I think we're going to see the federal implementation period coming to a close relatively soon. All of that will duplicate on the DOT side. So we know that the public comment period has been extended an additional 30 days, so that goes out to the end of April. The DOT will then review those comments and revise their guidance prior to issuing final notice. Now, a word on comments. So there's, as you saw before with Bill speaking, a lot of things they're asking comments on. So do we think this is going to be a fairly quick process? It is really hard to know. There's a lot of things they're asking for people to think about, review. They're going to have to go through all of those comments. They're then going to have to kind of cull them, summarize them, and determine whether they need to kind of come back out with another guidance document or if they'll go right to final. I think our hope, and everybody's hope, is that they go right to final notification, but we don't know how much time that's going to take. So once that happens, there will then be, just like the federal guidelines, there will be a general implementation timeline. And they'll have to do a lot of the same work that the federal guidelines did, which is work with MROs and work with the laboratories, because there may be some changes. And we know there are several changes already from the federal guidelines to the DOT guidelines. So whatever those changes are, they will have to make sure that everybody's very well aware of that. And then they'll be able to start having employers send samples into the laboratories once the laboratories are up and certified and ready to go. So the bottom line is we don't know how long it's going to take, but it will likely take some time. And I know initially they were hoping that the federal and the DOT guidelines would kind of ride alongside each other and be ready at the same time. My gut still tells me that the feds are going to be able to implement sooner, just because they're several years ahead of the process. So we think there's still going to be some time. Anybody's guess how long it is, but it's not going to be a couple of months. It will certainly be longer than that. And then the next slide, the next section we're going to go into is really talking about, why should I add oral fluid? So everybody's been used to doing urine testing for, 40 odd years at this point. And so the question really becomes for people, yeah, we see the benefits. Why should I think about adding oral fluid? And remember, this is not an all or none, right? So you can continue to do urine alongside with oral fluid. You can mix and match. And that's, one of the benefits of having another testing method to add in. And eventually when hair testing comes in, you'll have a third method that you can think about and add into your testing protocol. So if I go back to one of Bill's slides earlier, when he talked about the reasons for the notice of proposed rulemaking from a DOT perspective, and I note a couple of things here. To combat adulteration, all collections directly observed, potential cost savings, quick and easy collections, and fewer collection facilities required. So as we think about, in this slide, we're going to talk about pros and cons of urine testing. The next slide will be some pros and cons of oral fluid testing. But as we think about those pros and cons, think about that in the context of why the DOT is looking at oral fluid. So, one of the pros for urine, as I mentioned, long history of use. It's been around for a very long time, since the 1980s. So it's got that history. It's supported in most states. We know that it's withstood legal challenges. So it's a good, solid methodology. Widely available. Every lab that's out there is doing urine testing. So many labs are SAMHSA certified for urine testing, and a configurable panel. And that's great. You've got flexibility. When you're talking about lab-based testing, you can mix and match the panels, and that's great. And in addition to whatever the DOT is requiring, you could do additional testing for other drugs should you choose to do that. Some of the cons, privacy. So Bill had mentioned, toilet bowls, bluing agent, things like that. It's not very easy to take a urine test in the middle of a factory floor. You definitely need that privacy, and that that results many times in having to do an offsite collection. Depending on the type of employer and the facilities, they may not have private areas where you can use a restroom right then and there, which precipitates people having to go offsite, use a collection site. So when you talk about kind of going back to that fewer collection facility requirements as one of the pros for oral fluid, quick and easy collections, kind of that hits right there. Adulteration, I think we're all very well aware of how easy a urine test is to tamper with and adulterate, and clearly that's one of the reasons that the NPRM is really in favor of oral fluids. Observed collections, gender issues, in some cases, matching gender, especially if there's an observed collection. Shy bladder is another one. There are a lot of times when someone just can't go, whether it's a physiological condition like periuresis, or a psychological issue where they cannot urinate, or they just urinated and guess what? Now they've got to wait. They've got to drink some water. That clearly is an issue. Bill talked a lot about the window of detection. So from that perspective, there are pros and cons as far as perhaps recent use. And then the cost and cost fluctuation. If you're using a collection site, you're kind of at the mercy of that collection site raising their rates on you, and so on and so forth. So there is that side of it. And so now we're going to look at, from an oral fluid perspective, some of the pros and cons. So some of the pros: collect anytime, anywhere. As Bill said, it's really an observed collection. The employee, the donor, is actually doing the collection themselves. If you've ever seen an oral fluid collection done, the collector essentially hands the donor the package. The donor takes the package, they take the device out of the package, place it in their mouth. They then take that collection device, put it into the vial that goes to the laboratory. They put the chain of custody seal around it and seal it up. So it's very much really just an observed collection. But because all you're doing essentially is putting a collection device into your mouth, that can happen anywhere, anytime. So there's really no need for private restrooms or same gender collections. Adulteration is nearly impossible. We say nearly because nothing is ever 100% impossible. But there's been a lot of studies done regarding mouthwashes and gums and things like that, which really render themselves useless because there is a 10-minute wait period for any collection from an oral fluid perspective that's done. It doesn't matter which device you're using or manufacturer you're working with, there is a 10-minute wait. And saliva actually regenerates itself roughly every 10 minutes. So even if somebody were to, before going in to do the collection, be chewing on gum or using mouthwash, by the time that collection is done, that's pretty much negated by the fact that there's new saliva that has regenerated itself. Standardization of pricing, we kind of talk about that in the realm of, if you don't need to use a collection site and you do it on site, you've negated that side of the costing out. So you have a much better idea of what your cost is going to be. It's going to be for the device and the lab processing fees and the MRO review. Legally defensible, there have been a number of court cases. Remember, what you're doing here is you're using a screening technology and then going to the laboratory. It's no different than urine testing. So it would follow the same legal defensibility that you would from a urine perspective. Bill talked a little bit about the windows of detection and the recent use detection. Oral fluid, much like blood and even breath to a certain extent, mirrors what's going on in your body at that particular time. So there's no waiting period for drugs to metabolize through your system and be excreted via urine. So you do get that recent use detection. That shy bladder issue is eliminated because you're not obviously waiting for someone to urinate. And the reduced time from work comes from not having to use that collection site. Some of the cons, it is prohibited in some states, and so there's a number of things, and I know that Bill Current's group does a really nice job at looking at all the state laws and what's allowed and what's not allowed. So if you're not using CCG for that, they're a great resource for this. We know that there are a couple of states that do not allow for oral fluid testing at all. One of the interesting things, though, is one of the reasons that some of the states do not allow for it is because they go by the SAMHSA and DOT guidelines, in many cases the SAMHSA and the federal guidelines. And so with the federal guidelines now coming into play for oral fluid, that will open up some of the states where it was prohibited. But you also want to be checking for local ordinances. You want to look for workers' comp issues. Some states oral fluid is not available from a workers' comp perspective. So again, it can be a little bit convoluted. Inventory management is an issue as well. You know, when you think about a urine collection, the urine cups are easy to get, very inexpensive. The collection devices, no matter which company you're working with, do cost more than a urine cup, and then you've got to figure out where you're going to store them. You know, if you're going to be using an offsite collection center, do they have them? All of those kind of things. So there are some issues there that will need to be worked up. And that kind of goes to the next one, which is the upfront cost for employers. Because there is a little bit more cost for the collection device, you'll be needing to work with your laboratory or your MRO partner, your third-party administrator, to probably get a bundled cost and see how that kind of flows. But those are, again, some things that, you know, you would want to consider as if you were going to move forward with oral fluid. Sometimes dry mouth can pose issues, just like, you know, we do have shy bladder issues. There are people that maybe don't salivate as much. Most of the devices that are out there, and in fact, one of the requirements for devices is that you have a volume indicator. And so you'll know exactly when you've collected the sufficient amount, which is typically 1 ml of sample. And some people may take a little bit longer because they have dry mouth. So it may take longer to saturate the pad or to spit into a tube. So you do have those issues. And then use of outsourced collectors, you know, that could change the cost again. If you are not going to be doing the collection on site and want to do it off site at a collection site, it would be the same thing that you would have to think about from a urine perspective. If those costs go up, that would increase your cost a little bit. DOT's reasons, I think we talked about this already a few times, but, you know, looking to reduce overall cost, add flexibility. We know it's scientifically sound, it provides direct observation, reduces the likelihood of adulteration, and less invasive than some of the other traditional testing methods that are out there. So when would you use oral fluid then? If you're worried about should I be thinking about recent use, you know, in some of those circumstances where it might be reasonable suspicion or a random check or a post-accident check. Those may be certain circumstances where it would be good for oral fluid when you've got privacy and gender concerns. So you don't have to worry about, you know, observation and so on. Adulteration, cheating, you're suspecting something's going on, but you're not really sure. An oral fluid test may be a really good way for you to see, you know, whether somebody truly is using drugs and not necessarily beating the test with a urine test. And then shy bladder, obviously, if you've got someone that cannot urinate for whatever reason, oral fluid would be a good solution as an alternative. And so next steps, we're wrapping up, just 2 more slides here. Do I need to commit now to oral fluid? Absolutely not, right? And you can't, quite honestly. As I said, it's going to take some time for the guidelines to actually run through. So when that time comes, employers can choose to do both oral fluid and urine as desired. You know, one of the comments is, how would you prefer to do that? You know, for all testing rationale or reasons, or do you just pick it? And I think so that will be determined based on what the comments say. So we do encourage folks to kind of comment on their thoughts about how they see oral fluid fitting into a program that currently has urine today, and how you can customize your program to fit those needs. Different testing specimens should be used depending on the situation. If you're looking for historic use, recent use, or immediate use. And it'll be even more interesting when we have hair testing, because that historic use will be able to go much further back than either urine or oral fluid. So it'll be very interesting when we have a third methodology to choose from. And then lastly, are there already collection devices that are approved by the DOT? And at this point, there are not. So more information on collection devices will come when the final guidelines are issued. Keep in mind that for SAMHSA, for the federally regulated market, only FDA cleared devices, they must be single-use collection devices. They must indicate how much oral fluid has been collected, be sealable, non-leaking, maintain specimen integrity, as well as ensuring drug and drug metabolite stability. No substantial impact on the composition of drugs or drug metabolites, and must collect at least 1 ml of sample. So these are all things that were taken from the DOT directly from the federal guidelines, so they haven't really changed. The one difference that I am aware of, that I know that they're asking for comments and working through, is in the federal guidelines, they talk about the possibility of a sequential collection or a simultaneous collection. I believe that the DOT is really looking more towards a simultaneous collection and asking for comments based on that. And that really goes back to the Omnibus Act and what everyone knows and is very much aware of from a urine perspective, where it's one sample and then split into an A and a B. So there are still some outstanding questions revolving around the collection device and how that's going to work, and they're inviting comments on that as well. So with that, I think we are at the end. So I know we're right at 3 o'clock. So Bill, I don't know if we have time for any questions.
Yeah, let's do this. I've gone through the questions. There's some really good questions. For those who would like to stay on for just a few more minutes, let's answer a couple of questions. And for everybody who has to go, we're sorry that we're running a little over, but we're going to put all of the questions and answers in writing and send them out that way as well. But there are a couple of questions I think that you might like to take a stab at here. So Jessica, what do we have?
Sure. So we have a question. It asks, it came up short science-wise in 2004. What is it that makes up to par science-wise now about oral fluid testing?
Yeah, I think, and I was back, I was around back then, and I don't know that it's maybe an accurate statement to say it came up short science-wise. I think what everyone realized back then, they were trying to do too much. And so if you remember when I was kind of talking at the very beginning, they were looking at making the urine changes. They were looking at adding oral fluid, adding hair testing, as well as the possibility of adding rapid or point of care testing. And I think what everyone realized was it was just too much to put into one document. So what they ended up doing is saying, let's piecemeal this. They took the urine changes first. Then they decided to look at oral fluid because that was furthest along from a scientific perspective. Then they went to hair testing, which is what they're doing now. So that is my understanding, from kind of being back in it way back when, as to why that it didn't necessarily go through in 2004. But I can tell you there was a DTAB board membership, so that was the Drug Testing Advisory Board. It was made up of a number of scientists, and I don't know how many folks are aware of Dr. Ed Cohn, Marilyn Hustis, so very, very influential scientists who have been looking at oral fluid for decades. And they actually looked at a number of literature, hundreds and hundreds of literature pieces. There were studies that were done comparing urine to oral fluid. And in the end, that is what the DTAB made their unanimous decision back in 2011 to actually move the oral fluid guidance documents to where we got to in 2015, which was the draft, and then 2019. So, hopefully that helps to explain it a little bit. But there was a lot of oversight that went into, does it perform as well as urine testing? And the same oversight is going through the hair testing as we speak.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Another question that we had submitted even though the mandatory guidelines for oral fluids were published, there are still no SAMHSA certified labs to do federal oral fluid testing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is correct, and I did address that a little bit, and that is because the NLCP, so that's the National Laboratory Certified, basically the certifying body, and they're in Research Triangle Park, is really responsible for the laboratory proficiency testing programs, and they are in the process of getting everything finalized, and so once that is finalized, and we believe that is very, very close to being finalized, the labs will have a number of things that they haven't had to this point to become certified. So they really need to, they've got to have a proficiency testing program. The labs go through, I believe it's 2 PT cycles, which somewhere is in the range of 2 to 4 months of timing before. So once they actually have the proficiency testing, they have to go through 2 cycles to make sure that they are testing the way that they need to be. NLCP sends them blind samples. They have to get them all correct. On top of that, the manufacturers, such as OraSure, and there are a number of others, Abbott and Quest and Thermo, we all need to ensure that we have the assays and the device configured the way it needs to be configured. And all of that work is ongoing right now. We also have to have FDA clearance of the devices. So there's a lot of work that really needs to kind of come together. And that's why the implementation timing is generally as long as it is. There's a lot of things that need to kind of gel together before the certification can happen, but we're getting much closer to that day.
Thank you so much, Jackie. We want to thank all of those of you who've attended with us. Of course, we want to thank Bill and Jackie for going through the slides with us today and sharing with us information to help us make more informed decisions as we continue to move forward with this particular item of testing opportunity. And we do have a couple questions that we will answer offline. And we'll make sure that we send out the answers to those questions so that you can see those questions in a follow-up. Today's presentation was recorded, and you will receive access to the recording so you can review this information again. Additionally, this presentation qualified for continuing education credit from SHRM, from CCDAP, and from HRCI, and you will receive information on how to obtain those credits if you have qualified for the credit, which was to attend the live webinar. And other than that, we want to thank you all for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar presentation. Thank you and have a great day.